Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Snowed. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book, and it is Little Blue Book number 858, titled The Psychology of Leadership: What Makes It Possible for Individuals to Control and Move the Masses, written by Leo Markun. There is no copyright date in this one, but all the other books that I've done, Little Blue Books that I've done that were written by Leo Markun, were written in 1926. And we know that Leo Markun committed suicide late 1931, early 1932. So this was written prior to that time. So here we go. This book contains 3 chapters, and I'll try to break the reading up into the chapters. Those chapters are Sources of Authority, Suggestion and Crowd Psychology, and Chapter 3, Leadership in Industry. So here we go. The Psychology of Leadership, Sources of Authority, written by Leo Markun. The conception of leadership is sometimes made to include that of superiority. We say, for instance, that the United States leads in the production of automobiles, meaning that more, or it might be better, cars are manufactured in this country than in any other. But to lead meant originally to bring or take a person or animal, especially to take into captivity. By a leader, we now mean a guide, a conductor, a chief, or a commander. The term leader, according to Professor Lowes, implies influence or directing power, as in a political party or in an enterprise. We are concerned here, then, not with general excellence, but rather with the power of one human being to influence and direct others. Napoleon, obviously, was a great leader. Shakespeare was not. He had no courtier, no imitators. Edmund Spenser, John Donne, and Walt Whitman, all poets, distinctly inferior to Shakespeare, were, each in his time, more important as literary leaders. Dr. Johnson, whose writings hardly interest us at all now, made a great impression upon the authors who knew him. The Great Bear did possess the power of leadership. The outstanding directors of men, though, are not to be found amongst artists or scientists. We think rather of military commanders, politicians, statesmen, of rulers in general. Certain heads of great industries, too, are among the leaders of our time. Mussolini is far more important as a leader than Edison, although he is a good deal below him in genius and true greatness. Ought we to attribute leadership to those men who hardly influence their contemporaries, but whose ideas prevail after their death? For example, shall we consider Jesus of Nazareth as the head of a small and ragged group of Israelites? Or shall we attribute to him the leadership of the millions of Christians who have lived in the last 1900 years? It is exceedingly difficult to tell just how far Christian doctrine is derived from a Jewish young man known as Jesus, the son of Joseph. The influence of one Saul or Paul of Taurus is undoubtedly much more important. These two together, even, are by no means responsible for the present status of Christianity. Many thousands of other men have in one way or another changed the course of the history of the church and its sects. Only in the case of a writer is it comparatively easy to tell how far he exerts an influence upon the people who live after him. Even in such a case, though, all sorts of modifying influences arise. The Platonists of our time respond not merely to the ideas of Plato, but also to those of Plotinus, Pico, Della Mirandola. Della Mirandola. and a host of other disciples more or less removed of the original master. All things considered, I feel that it is better to think of leadership chiefly in terms of immediate influence. Only so does the leader enjoy the fruits of his power. These may be various, but the sense of superiority is probably the most important. The desire to be mighty, although it is not instinctive in human beings, arises in most of them. We measure power in terms of that enjoyed by our neighbors. Hence, we do not derive any extraordinary satisfaction from the possession of a vehicle self-propelled by an engine with the strength of 20 horses, provided that we see many automobiles which we do not own and which have engines of 80 or 100 horsepower. The ability to control machines and brute animals is far less regarded than power over human beings. Insofar as we submit to the leadership of another, we imply his superiority to us. When we go fishing in the sea, perhaps we hire a guide to bring us where the bass or the bluefish or the terrapins are to be found. Thus, we tactily admit that he knows more about the matter than we do. When we take up golf, we ask a professional golfer to advise us as to the proper equipment to use and the right way to make use of it. Or we go to a physician to recommend a diet and a course of treatment, because it is his business to understand disease. The specialist is a leader in matters pertaining to his field with regard to people outside of it because of his supposed or actual superiority in education and experience. The man who is engaged in research, though he may be the superior in knowledge and wisdom of those who communicate his findings, is sometimes less of a leader. But, of course, his influence may be great even though indirect. Special knowledge seldom leads to absolute control of human beings in our time, but it has sometimes brought about this result, notably in the case of priests and magicians. Here, the notion of an influence with a deity or the malignant and benevolent spirits because of consecration or divine birth may be involved. But during the medieval period in Europe, the ability to sign one's name was almost enough to win a reputation for magic. Even in the enlightened 18th century, that magnificent charlatan, Jacopo Casanova, used abracadabra and hocus pocus to such good purpose that Mime de Fleur stood almost entirely under his control. And yet, the lady believed herself to be a magician and alchemist of great power. In her opinion, Casanova's mastery arose from the charms and the black formulas which he knew how to handle. In some countries where the Roman Catholic priests control affairs, they exert their power largely through their supposed ability to absolve from sin and thus to open the gates to paradise. It is to their interest to keep knowledge from the masses, above all to prevent them from thinking too clearly. The dissolution of ignorance, as they realize, would put a strain upon their dominance. The Druids and other esoteric priests have always made much of the fact that the members had special knowledge which required the respect of those who had not been initiated. The secret fraternities of the present day attempt to attain ascendancy in the same manner, though through hidden doctrines. We fear the unknown and respect those who are able to control it. The autocratic czars of Russia understood fully the value of ignorance as a subduing force. Their successors, considering themselves trustees for the proletariat, have adopted the policy of encouraging education among the working classes and making it difficult for the children of the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie. Physical force has always been an important means of domination. The Greek scholar who was captured by a Roman army and sold as a slave to a Roman partisan might be far above his owner in all important intellectual qualities. The power of the empire, however, guaranteed his servitude. As a slave, he did what his master bade him. If he ventured to disobey an order, or if he chanced even unwittingly to offend his master, he might at any time be unceremoniously stripped, tied up to the ceiling with a weight at his feet, and scourged. As a general rule, the slave learns quickly to serve and fawn upon his owner. Only by self-abasement and utter obedience does he escape from the worst pains. It must not be supposed, though, that the slave has visions of a whipping constantly before him. He falls into the habit of respecting continued authority, and emancipation would leave servitude in him still. In the book of Deuteronomy, we find the command, "And if thy brother, an Hebrew man, or an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee. Thou shalt furnish him liberally out of thy flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress. And it shall be, if he says unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee, and thy house, because he is well with thee, then thou shalt take an awl, and thrust it through his ear unto the door, and he shall be thy servant forever." It is evident, then, that some of the Hebrew slaves refused to be liberated, having forgotten how to live as free men and women. Many of the Russian serfs and the colored slaves in the United States who were emancipated in the 19th century similarly expressed preference for continuing to live under the control of others. Many dynasties, which were set up by force, have continued to rule by the consent of the governed. It is evident that George V does not depend upon any army under his personal control to keep him king of Great Britain. In most of British dominions, too, his position does not rest upon force. It is true, of course, that George is more a figurehead than a true leader. Those persons who really control the policies of the empire realize the value in the less civilized colonies of a ruler who is such by the grace of God. Many monarchs have insisted upon their own divinity as gods or the descendants of gods. They become at once endowed with power beyond those which inhere in the strength and loyalty of their bodyguard. No man has sufficient physical force in his own hands to control 3 or 4 persons of ordinary strength and intelligence, who are united against him. When we see a single individual, perhaps a physical weakling, receive the homage of millions, we must realize above all the power of habit. Certainly there must be many people in Japan who can see no inherent divinity in Mikado, but almost all of them feel that it would be inconvenient and unnecessary to proclaim the fact. I do not mean merely that they fear for their own safety. If they consider the matter deeply, they usually arrive at the conclusion that a general analysis of moral values might endanger some of their own privileges. Atheists have sat upon the papal throne and ruled by virtue of the privileges which Jesus Christ is alleged to have given Peter and those who should succeed him as bishops of Rome. Men who were well known by those about them not to possess an iota of religious feeling, some of whom committed openly almost all the crimes which the Church deemed unpardonable, remained undisturbed in the enjoyment of their dignities. It is true that the Roman courtiers benefited too much from conditions, as they were to seek to overthrow them. The great masses of the faithful remained ignorant of the facts, confident that none but a saint could be elected to succeed the holy rock upon whom the church was established. They knew, indeed, that not all the bishops behaved as well as they might, and they sometimes had their suspicions about the higher dignitaries. But even Luther himself, a priest, was greatly surprised at what he found in Rome. Patronage is frequently important as a means of domination. The tyrant prince ordinarily hands over some of his authority and special privileges to the more important of his followers, or even to some of his former enemies, and thus binds them over to his interest. The British in India and the Dutch in the East Indies have consistently profited by the policy of recognizing the sovereignty of the native rulers. The American political leader shares his spoils with a host of satellites. Often he is generous to the poor, especially if they are voters or potential voters. The buying of suffrage was not invented in the United States. It is an institution of great antiquity, and it has not always been considered particularly dishonorable. The candidate for office who pays for votes ordinarily expects to receive from the public treasury upon election more than his election expenses. Those persons and corporations that contribute to the cost of candidacy usually count, as we may suppose, upon some form of requital in case their candidate is successful. The following dialogue between Mr. Havemeyer and Senator Allen of an investigating committee of 1893 is illuminative. Senator Allen: why should the American Sugar Refining Company contribute to either of the political parties in the state of New York? Mr. Haymeyer: we have large interests in this state, police protection and fire protection. They need everything that the city furnishes and gives, and they have to support these things. Every individual and corporation and firm, trust, or whatever you call it, does these things, and we do them. Senator Allen: and you contribute to both parties with the expectation that whichever party succeeds, your interests will be guarded? Mr. Haymeyer: we have a good deal of local protection for our contribution. Senator Allen: therefore you feel at liberty to contribute to both parties? Mr. Haymeyer: it depends. In the state of New York, where the Democratic majority is between 40,000 and 50,000, we throw it their way. In the state of Massachusetts, where the Republican Party is doubtful, they probably have the call. Every man in New York is working for his pocket, said Mr. Crocker apologetically, when he was questioned regarding the personal use he had made of his power as a political dictator. The members of his machine responded to his instructions because they knew that party irregularity would not be tolerated. It was not out of unselfish devotion either to the boss or to their constituents that the New York legislators carried out Crocker's will. The Tammany leaders, most adroit of politicians, have always tried to make the masses feel that they were supporting their cause. Most important than outright bribery and other forms of corruption have usually been flattery and friendliness. The political leader is one of the boys. He kisses the babies, passes round the cigars, sees that a poor widow is not evicted from her tenement. Speeders and spitters and violators of various minor ordinances are seldom fined or even brought to court if they have a little influence in the proper places. Even those who break more serious laws are often aided by their political friends. Besides this, selfish political leaders are often ready to erect public buildings, to open up parks and recreation centers, to pave new streets, and to put in sewers. Thus, they arouse the gratitude of those persons who make use of the new facilities, but who pay little or nothing directly in taxes. Also, politicians help their friends who have or who proceed to buy land which is taken over by the city or which will be increased in value by the municipal improvements. Usually, they receive tangible marks of appreciation from the building and paving concerns which do the work. The rulers of Rome used to give bread and circus to the rabble of free citizens, but even the conquered provinces were kept loyal to the empire by definite advantages. The Gauls and the Iberians were given splendid roads and aqueducts, law and order, many of the advantages of classical culture. Their subjection, arising out of their inferiority in military strength, was continued largely because of this sharing of benefits. In the life of societies, says Professor Edward Ainsworth Ross, no phenomenon is more general, persistent, recurring, or frequent than domination. Not only has each social group brought adjacent social groups under its power, so far as it could or dared, but each element within the group subjects other elements to its will as far as it can. The motive to dominate is chiefly lust of exploitation, but it may also be love of mastery or the desire to extend a religion or a civilization. The attempt to widen the influence of a special form of culture or system of worship, even when it appears and is claimed to be wholly altruistic, is almost always associated with a desire to exploit. Exploitation means using others for one's own purposes, especially when they lose rather than gain by being thus made use of. It depends upon some sort of domination. Ross lists the forms of exploitation as sexual, religious, egotistic, and economical. A slave may be sacrificed in honor of his master's god, or made to perform menial services in a temple. He may turn his owner's mills or pick his cotton. He may act as his personal servant. The female slave, less often the male, is made to cohabit with the master or with those to whom the master accords the privilege. Of course, exploitation does not depend upon absolute legal slavery. The young woman who employs her choral wisdom and charms to part a middle-aged egg dealer from some of his savings is using him for her own ends. So is the politician who takes from the taxpayers more than he gives them in return. Similarly, if we are to take the Marxian doctrine at its face value, the capitalist exploits those who receive his wages. But if we believe that the working man serves himself as well as the entrepreneur and those who supply the capital, we can hardly speak of him as being exploited. According to classical economic theory, our industrial system leaves all parties free to do what is best for themselves. The laborer then makes use of the employer, just as the employer makes use of the laborer. Domination does not necessarily bring about exploitation, although it usually has this result. Of the types of control that that of parents over offspring is one of the most familiar. We are inclined to think of the relationship as a trusteeship. The father who whips his son never says, I am doing this because I enjoy it. Rather, he insists, I am doing this for your own good. The laws of most ancient states give definite rights to the children. For example, they may not be sent out to help the family budget when they are 6 or 8, but must attend school until they are 14 or 16. It is true that the children would often prefer to go to work rather than to continue their education, but the idea prevails that the state will be better off if most of its members are literate. In most primitive states, the father's authority over his children was absolute. He could decide whether the newborn baby should or should not be permitted to live. Among the Romans, grown sons and daughters were frequently subjected to corporal punishment. The son, according to law, was not servus, a slave to his father, but yet stood in servitude or subjection to him. Under early Roman law, the son could have no property of his own. The authority which a man possessed over those who sprung from his loins became known as patria potestas. This power tended to weaken with the advance of Roman civilization. The implicit obedience of rude men to their parent, says Sir Henry Summer Maine, is doubtless a primary fact, which it would be absurd to explain away altogether by attributing to them any calculation of its advantages. But, at the same time, if it is natural in the sons to obey the father, it is equally natural that they should look to him for superior strength or superior wisdom. Hence, when societies are placed under circumstances which cause an especial value to be attached to bodily and mental vigor, there is an influence at work which tends to confine the patria potestas to the cases where its possessor is actually skillful and strong. And he instances the Homeric case of Laertes, who in his old age exercises no authority over his son Odysseus. In place of the father's father or the father, some primitive societies have given authority to the mother's brothers. In some exceptional cases, the mother herself has definite power. Among the Iroquois and Huron Indians, for instance, women were recognized as being at the head of their households. Also, they elected the chiefs and made up the majority of the tribal councils. The chiefs themselves, however, were always men. In some matriarchal states, domination over the children is divided between the mother and the maternal uncles, and where the father or the eldest male member is considered the head of the family, he frequently divides his authority with a family council, in which all the adults or all the adult males participate. Frequently, the old are given domination and special privileges over the young. The origin of their power lies, no doubt, in their reputed wisdom, as well as in the habits of obedience formed in childhood. In several parts of the world, elderly men take the most desirable wives to themselves, leaving for the young men chiefly aged widows. Husbands have usually had authority over their wives. In Russia, during the performance of a marriage, the bride's father used formally to strike his daughter lightly with a whip, then to hand it over to the groom to show that the power of chastisement was thereafter to be his. Westermarck reports a number of rites of similar import, along with a few indicating a struggle between husband and wife for ascendancy in the household. According to the theory of Roman law, when a woman married, she became included with the patria potestas of her husband. Legally, then, she was her husband's daughter, and he had the broad authority over her, which he was also to hold over his children. Later, there was a tendency for this power to weaken, and at the time when Christianity arose, the Roman matron possessed great independence. But the canon law again made the wife practically the slave of her husband. This was the situation in the common law of England, too, although the relationship has gradually been modified during the last few centuries. With the domination of the husband over the wife, has gone a certain amount of control by men as such over women. On the other hand, there is a strong tendency for men to be dominated by the woman they love. This is prompted by the rhythmical nature of the sexual impulse in women and by its general manifestations as compared with the constant and particular sexual demands of men. When law and custom forbid the male to impose his physical strength upon the female, he frequently falls into the position of the beggar or the generous purchaser. The fighting members of society have usually been recognized as holding a higher position than members of the merchant and agricultural classes. From them arose most members of the old nobility, but often they have themselves had to accept the domination of the priests. At the present time, the tendency is to exalt the great industrial leaders. The political and military heads feel, more or less definitely, that they are bound to protect big business. Thomas Carlyle, in his book on hero worship, and the heroic in history, deals with the hero as divinity, as prophet, as poet, as priest, as man of letters, and as king. Universal history, he says, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the molders, patterns, and in a wide sense, the creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or to attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer, what is that? The outer what? Properly the outer material result, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world, the soul of the whole world's history, it may justly be considered, were the history of these, and he speaks of the divine relation, which in all times unites a great man to other men. We may profitably pause, though, to notice that if a great man stamps his personality upon his contemporaries and upon history, he is also a product of his environment. Thus, Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and opened up the Americas to European colonization. But if he had not done it, if he had somehow failed, there can be little doubt that some other navigator would soon have accomplished the same thing. The leader is also the led. He depends upon circumstances. There are very few men of whom we feel that they would have been great in any country and at any time. Perhaps Leonardo da Vinci is one. Benvenuto Cellini is another name that suggests itself. But probably these men could not have brought about what they accomplished in the age of the Renaissance if they had lived at any other period in the world's history. The scientific historians seek to explain changes in ideas and social organization in terms of forces which are largely impersonal. And I think that truth is with them, not with Carlyle's ecstatic worship of heroes. He exclaims, I say, find me the true conning king, able men, and he has a divine right over me. But this is true only so far as we have need of an able man, or as he is capable of exerting authority over us. The great merit of Carlyle's heroes is their originality, and and this is said to depend upon their sincerity, as we depend upon such leaders, though we give up something of our own truth seeking, of our own heroism. Ah me, says Carlyle, that a man can be self subsistent, original, true, or what we call it, is surely the farthest in the world from indisposing him to reverence and believe other men's truth. A man embraces truth with his eyes open, and because his eyes are open, does not need to shut them because he can love his teacher of truth. But a critical consideration of the men who are considered great, the readiness to take from them the valuable things they have to offer, must not be confounded with the worshipping of heroes. Few, if any, of the men whom Carlyle selects as being truly great were temperamentally qualified for the disinterested seeking of truth. Muhammad was about as egotistic as Napoleon. Cromwell believed himself to be chosen of God to realize an idea, but it was an exceedingly narrow one. This is true of Luther and Knox as well. Dante, Shakespeare, and Burns were, of course, men of genius, but they are hardly in our narrow conception of the word to be considered leaders. Johnson and Rosset possessed many of the qualities of leadership, but much of their influence was of doubtful value. They were both men of their time, although they each emphasized different sides of the spirit of the 18th century. Emerson remarks in Representative Men that nature seems to exist for the excellent. The world is upheld by the veracity of good men. They make the earth wholesome. The search after the great is the dream of youth and the most serious occupation of mankind. The knowledge that in the city is a man who invented the railroad raises the credit of all the citizens. But enormous populations, if they be beggars, are disgusting, like moving cheese, like hills of ants or of fleas. The more, the worse. Emerson's book appeared 9 years later than Carlyle's essay on hero worship, and was evidently influenced by it. Pardon me. In his essay dealing with power, Emerson asks, "Who shall set a limit to the influence of a human being?" And he continues, "There are men who, by their sympathetic attractions, carry nations with them and lead the activity of the human race. Life is a search after power, and this is an element with which the world is so saturated. There is no chink or crevice in which it is not lodged, that no honest seeking goes unrewarded. But this seeming piece of optimism he follows with, the key to the age may be this, or that, or the other, as the young orators describe. The key to all ages is imbecility. Imbecility in the vast majority of men at all times, and even in heroes, in all but certain eminent moments, victims of gravity, custom, and fear. This gives force to the strong, that the multitude have no habit of self-reliance or original action. There are many suggestive thoughts in Emerson which might be quoted, but the best of his works are available in the Little Blue Book series. Emerson's idea that the leaders have power simply because most people are without initiative seems to me to fit the facts. However much we may believe in individuality, though, perhaps all the more for thinking of men and women as individual selves, we must realize the necessity of leadership. The world has become so complex that no one man can understand how to respond to all problems. Certainly no man or woman can be self-sufficient. We must have coordination and direction. Unfortunately, it is not always the persons who could make good use of authority upon whom the powers of leadership are conferred. The heads of affairs in a democracy are often extremely selfish, but worse than this, they are very frequently unintelligent as well. Where they are irresponsible, they can be tyrannical without suffering from the consequences of their tyranny. We are wont to pride ourselves upon the supposed fact that ours is a government by law rather than by men. Our state legislatures, and to a lesser extent the Congress at Washington, are hedged about with constitutional limitations. But the growth of institutions breaks down the qualities of leadership by denying them a proper outlet. Our system of checks and balances, arising out of a realization that our public officials are almost all mediocre men, helps to perpetuate that condition. After all, rule by the people is an impossibility. It is better, then, that we should be governed by responsible individuals rather than by those who are supposed to have little power. The attempts to divide authority often lead to its concentration in the hands of more or less anonymous groups and individuals. Since they are not officially trustees, we cannot call them to account. We seldom know precisely who they are. And I think that's where we'll end right there. Yep, that's where we'll stop for part 1. It's not quite to the end of the chapter, but that's okay. That's where we're going to stop for today for this part of my reading, and I'm looking for something to mark my page. I'll just have to remember. So, this brings to an end part 1 of Little Blue Book number 858, titled The Psychology of Leadership: What Makes It Possible for Individuals to Control and Move the Masses, written by Leo Markun, somewhere in the 1926, 27, something like that. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.